There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a coffee shop counter when a farmer says something nobody in the room expected to hear. And I want you to picture that silence before I tell you anything else. Because I was sitting 3 stools down when it happened, and I watched every single face along that counter shift at once, the way a flock of birds shifts direction mid-flight without any one bird seeming to give the signal. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. A fork stopped mid-bite over a plate of eggs going cold. Even the waitress, refilling a mug 2 seats down, slowed enough that a little coffee sloshed over the rim without anyone noticing or caring. The man's name was Gene, and what he'd just said, in a voice that carried more conviction than volume, was that he'd traded in his brand-new tractor. The one he'd bought less than 2 years earlier, the one with the touchscreen display and the climate-controlled cab, and a price tag that had made half the county whistle through their teeth when the news first got around, for a Massey Ferguson that had to be pushing 40 years old. I want you to sit with that trade for a second, the way that whole diner sat with it, because on paper it doesn't make a lick of sense. Gene hadn't traded down out of desperation. He wasn't behind on payments. He hadn't lost the farm or fallen on hard times the way you sometimes hear about in stories like this. He'd walked into that dealership of his own accord on a Tuesday morning and voluntarily handed over the keys to a machine most farmers in that county would have considered a step up in every measurable way, in exchange for something that, by every modern metric that gets printed in a glossy equipment catalog, represented a step backward by 4 decades. I got called into this story a few weeks later, not by Gene directly, but by his son, a younger man named Ty who ran the mechanical side of the operation and who wanted somebody with fresh eyes to go over that old Massey before planting season really got underway. Because, as he put it to me on the phone, half the county's watching this tractor like it's a horse race, and I don't want my dad proven wrong over something as stupid as a bad water pump. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know about the pressure sitting on that machine before I ever laid eyes on it. This wasn't just a tractor anymore. It had become a referendum, a walking, working symbol of an argument that had apparently been simmering across every coffee shop counter and dealership parking lot in the county for weeks, about whether new, expensive, computerized equipment was actually worth what it cost, or whether an older generation of simpler, tougher machines had been quietly right the whole time, waiting patiently in barns and backlots for somebody brave enough or stubborn enough to remember what they were capable of. I've heard plenty of arguments like this over the years, usually confined to good-natured grumbling, but rarely had I heard of one crystallizing so completely around a single, specific machine that everyone in a 15-mile radius could point to and watch. I drove out to Gene's place on a cool morning in early spring, gravel crunching under my tires past fields still holding the ghost of last year's stubble, past a windbreak of old cottonwoods just starting to bud, their bark silvered with age. And I found the Massey Ferguson parked in the yard exactly where you'd expect a working tractor to sit, not tucked away in a shed for admiration, but out where the weather could get at it. Mud still crusted along the lower half of its wheels from whatever job it had finished the evening before. Its paint had faded to a soft, dusty red, scarred here and there with the honest nicks and scrapes of decades spent actually working rather than sitting for show. One headlamp bezel dented just enough to tell a story nobody had bothered explaining to me yet. And there was a particular kind of confidence in the way it sat there, low and square and unbothered, that machines with a lot to prove simply don't carry. Gene came out to meet me, a man somewhere in his 60s with the kind of weathered, sun-creased face that comes only from decades spent outdoors rather than any amount of time spent worrying about how things look, his hands thick and calloused in the specific way that tells you a man has spent a lifetime gripping steering wheels and wrench handles rather than a keyboard. He didn't launch into a defense of his decision the way I half expected. Instead, he leaned against the tractor's fender, arms crossed, boots planted in the mud like he'd grown there, and told me the whole story from the beginning, in the unhurried, matter-of-fact cadence of a man who's had a lot of time to think through exactly what he wants to say about something. He told me the new tractor had looked perfect on paper, fuel efficiency numbers that beat anything else in its class, a cab so quiet and climate-controlled that his back stopped aching for the first time in years during long planting days, a touchscreen dashboard that could tell him tire pressure, fuel consumption, and engine diagnostics down to numbers he'd never even known existed on a tractor before, updating in real time in bright, crisp graphics that had genuinely impressed him the first week he owned it. For the first several months, he told me, he genuinely believed he'd made the smartest purchase of his farming life, and he'd even found himself, more than once, quietly needling old-timers at the co-op about being stuck in the past. And then he said the small failures started. Not catastrophic ones, not the kind of dramatic breakdown that makes for an easy story. Just small, maddening, expensive ones. A sensor failure that shut the whole engine down mid-field because a single wire connector had corroded, a problem that would have taken him 20 minutes to diagnose and fix himself on an older machine, but instead required a service call from a dealership technician 40 miles away because the diagnostic system was locked behind proprietary software he wasn't permitted to access himself. He described sitting in that stalled cab for over 3 hours waiting on that technician, watching perfect planting weather slide by outside the windshield, unable to do a single thing about it himself despite 40 years of hands-on farming experience, because the machine simply wouldn't let him in. A software update that bricked the transmission control module for 3 full days during the exact week he needed to be planting, leaving him standing in his own field, staring at a $180,000 machine that wouldn't move an inch because a server somewhere hundreds of miles away hadn't finished pushing an update through. He told me he'd called the dealership in frustration, only to be told, politely but unhelpfully, that these things happen sometimes with new systems, and that somebody would get to him as soon as they could work him into the schedule. He told me about the day that finally broke something loose in him. It was a Thursday in late April, prime planting weather, the kind of window that doesn't come around twice in a season if you miss it, and his tractor had thrown an error code he'd never seen before. Something about an emission sensor malfunction that the onboard computer insisted meant the entire machine needed to be towed in for diagnostic work before it would run again, even though, as far as Jean could tell standing there kicking the tire in frustration, the engine itself sounded perfectly healthy, idling smooth and strong beneath a hood that gave no outward sign of anything wrong at all. He said he sat in that cab for a long moment, staring at a screen that was telling him in polite, sterile corporate language that a machine he owned outright wasn't allowed to work until somebody else on somebody else's schedule said it could. That was the moment, he told me, that he started remembering his own father's stories about the tractors that had come before all this. Machines you could diagnose with your own 2 hands and a good set of wrenches. Machines that didn't lock you out of your own engine bay with a password screen. Machines built during an era when farmers were still trusted to understand and maintain the equipment they'd paid good money to own. So he made some calls, and within a couple of weeks he'd found a Massey Ferguson 2 counties over, owned by a retiring farmer who'd kept it running clean and honest for decades. No rust holes, no neglect, just the ordinary, well-earned wear of a machine that had spent its whole life exactly where it was supposed to be. He drove out, looked it over, and made the trade that got him laughed at across every coffee counter in the county for the better part of a month. I asked him if the mockery had bothered him, and he gave me a look that told me the question amused him more than it stung. He said the funniest part was watching his neighbors talk about reliability and modern efficiency, while half of them were quietly dealing with their own service calls and software glitches they didn't mention out loud because admitting a $180,000 machine had problems felt, to a lot of proud men in that county, like admitting they'd made a bad decision. He told me he'd overheard, more than once, some version of the same story he'd lived through himself, whispered rather than announced, from men who'd never dream of trading back the way he had, but who clearly recognized every frustration he described. Gene said he'd rather be laughed at for an honest trade than quietly frustrated behind a smile at the diner counter. Ty, standing nearby while his father talked, told me the real pressure hadn't come from the joking so much as from watching his father's decision get treated like a live experiment by half the county, every single field pass now apparently subject to public commentary. Neighbors would slow down on the county road just to watch the old Massey work a field, comparing its pace, its precision, its fuel stops against whatever modern machine they were running themselves, looking, Ty said, almost hopeful that it might stumble, if only to settle an argument that had started feeling less like friendly ribbing and more like something people had genuinely staked a piece of their own pride on. He admitted there'd been nights early on when he'd lain awake himself, worrying that a bad breakdown at the wrong moment might turn his father into a cautionary tale repeated at that same diner counter for years to come. The kind of story that outlives the actual facts of what happened and just becomes shorthand for a lesson nobody quite remembers accurately. That's the pressure I was walking into when Ty asked me to go over the tractor before the season's heaviest jobs started. Not just an ordinary pre-season inspection, but essentially a referendum on whether an old machine could hold up against modern expectations while half a county watched and waited to see who'd been right. I finished my inspection, made a handful of small adjustments, a belt tension slightly looser than ideal, a grease fitting that had been missed on the last service, and told Gene and Ty both that this tractor was as ready for a hard planting season as any machine I'd looked at in years, old or new. Ty looked relieved in a way that told me he'd been carrying more worry about this whole situation than he'd let on, his shoulders dropping a visible half-inch the moment I said it. I want to walk you through what I actually found on that Massey, because the honest mechanical truth of the situation matters more than the folklore that had already started building up around it. This wasn't a miracle machine running on stubbornness and nostalgia alone. It was a well-built, well-maintained piece of equipment from an era when engineers designed things to be understood, repaired, and kept running indefinitely by the people who actually used them, rather than designed to funnel every repair back through a dealership's service department. The engine itself was a straightforward diesel, mechanically injected, no computer standing between the fuel pump and the cylinders deciding when and how much to inject. I pulled the valve cover and found clean, honest wear, the kind that tells you a machine has been serviced on schedule its whole life, rather than neglected and then abused to compensate. Rocker arms showing even polished wear patterns rather than the galling and scoring you find on something run hard without proper attention. Compression across all cylinders came back strong and even, the kind of numbers that told me this engine had plenty of working life left in it, regardless of how many decades separated its build date from whatever calendar year we happened to be standing in. The transmission was a simple, mechanical affair, gears you could feel engage through a lever, rather than software interpreting your intentions through a touchscreen and executing them somewhere in a black box you weren't allowed to open. I traced the hydraulic lines, checked the clutch linkage, tested the play in the shift forks by hand, and found everything exactly where decades of straightforward mechanical logic told me it should be. Nothing hidden behind a locked access panel, nothing requiring a subscription or a software license to diagnose. What struck me most, working through that machine piece by piece, wasn't that it lacked modern conveniences. It obviously did. No climate control, no touch screen, nothing but a straightforward gauge cluster telling you oil pressure, temperature, and fuel level in the same honest, analog language tractors had used for generations. What struck me was how completely legible the whole machine was. Every system told its own story plainly, without translation, without a corporate server somewhere deciding whether you were allowed to understand what your own engine was doing. I could trace a wire from its origin to its destination with my own two eyes, no wiring diagram locked behind a paywall required to make sense of it. I finished my inspection, made a handful of small adjustments, a belt tension slightly looser than ideal, a grease fitting that had been missed on the last service, and told Jean and Ty both that this tractor was as ready for a hard planting season as any machine I'd looked at in years, old or new. Ty looked relieved in a way that told me he'd been carrying more worry about this whole situation than he'd let on. The real test came a few weeks later, during a stretch of planting that turned unexpectedly brutal. A late cold snap had compressed the entire county's planting window into barely 10 workable days, every farmer racing the same shrinking calendar, every piece of equipment in the area running longer hours than usual, under exactly the kind of sustained pressure that exposes whatever weaknesses a machine has been quietly hiding. Fields that should have been worked at an easy, unhurried pace suddenly needed covering dawn to dusk, and often well past dusk, headlights cutting through early spring darkness, engines running 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours at a stretch, with barely enough time for fuel and a quick check under the hood before starting again. This was the moment, I think, that everyone watching Jean's decision had secretly been waiting for. The moment that would either validate the mockery or silence it for good. Jean ran that Massey nearly around the clock during that window, and I heard about it mostly secondhand, through Ty's occasional phone calls checking in on some detail or another. The tractor ran. Not perfectly, not without a single hiccup. A fuel filter needed changing sooner than expected, given the extended hours, and a hydraulic hose showed the first signs of wear that any machine its age would eventually show under that kind of sustained strain. But every single issue that came up was something Jean diagnosed and fixed himself, standing in his own field, using his own hands, and a toolbox he'd kept in the same spot behind the seat for years, without a single phone call to a dealership, without a single day lost waiting for a technician or a software update to arrive from somewhere else. Ty told me his father actually seemed to enjoy those small roadside repairs, treating each one less like an interruption and more like a familiar conversation with an old friend who occasionally needed a little attention. Meanwhile, word came around, quietly at first and then less quietly, that at least 2 of the newer, more expensive tractors working neighboring fields that same brutal week had each lost the better part of a full day apiece to service calls and diagnostic delays, exactly the kind of downtime that costs real money and real yield during a compressed planting window nobody in that county could afford to lose. One neighbor, according to Ty, had spent the better part of an entire afternoon on hold with a manufacturer's technical support line, while his own field sat half-planted under a sky that everyone could see was about to turn against them. By the time that 10-day stretch ended, the conversation at that same diner counter had shifted in a way I found genuinely satisfying to witness secondhand. The same neighbors who'd laughed at Jean's trade a few months earlier were now the ones asking him, a little sheepishly, what he thought an old Massey like that might be worth if a fella wanted to track one down for himself. Some of them going so far as to ask whether he knew of any others sitting quietly in a barn somewhere, waiting for somebody to remember what they were capable of. Jean told me later that he never felt the need to gloat about any of it, and I believed him, because the tractor itself had made whatever argument needed making, simply by doing exactly what it was built to do, consistently, honestly, without requiring anyone's permission along the way. He said the whole experience had taught him something he suspected his own father had understood decades earlier without ever needing to put it into words, that the newest, shiniest version of something isn't always the same thing as the best version, and that sometimes the wisest move a person can make is trusting a machine built during an era when reliability wasn't a marketing term, but simply the only acceptable outcome. I think about Jean's tractor often, the way I think about every machine that ends up teaching an entire community something none of them expected to learn from a simple equipment trade. I've spent years now watching farmers wrestle with exactly this tension between the genuine conveniences modern machinery offers and the quiet, stubborn value of equipment built to be understood and repaired by the very hands that depend on it. There's no universal right answer sitting at the bottom of that tension, and I don't think Jean's story is really an argument that old is always better than new. Plenty of modern equipment does its job admirably, and plenty of old iron has been left to rot in fence rows for good reason. But it is, I think, a pretty clear argument that reliability, real reliability, the kind that shows up exactly when you need it most during a 10-day window with no room for error, still matters more than any touchscreen ever will. That Massey Ferguson is still running today, still parked out in Jean's yard where the weather can get at it, still doing exactly what it was built to do, decades after most people would have assumed a machine that age had nothing left to prove. And every spring now, when planting season rolls back around, I hear that a few more trucks slow down along that same county road, watching that old red tractor work its way across the field, no longer looking for it to fail, but simply admiring a machine and a man that turned out to know exactly what they were doing all along.